All right, welcome to Lecture 3 for EDD 939 Module 5. And this is really kind of the continuation of the previous lecture. Went a little bit long talking about general planning, so this lecture probably will be a little bit shorter. So I don't think any of you will complain about that. Of course, I always say that, and then they run as long anyway, but hopefully this one won't be quite as long. But what I want to talk about in this module is this idea of scenario planning. And again, as I mentioned in the last lecture, there's all kinds of different ways to approach planning. And the reality is you can spend a lot of money paying consultants to come in and to teach you their methodology on how to plan. And what they will tell you is that theirs is the way, and they'll tell you things like, if you've done planning in the past and you've never done anything with it, and is it just a binder sitting on your shelf, some of the things we've talked about in this class, then you need to use our system. We'll guarantee that you'll do something with it. And honestly, they can't guarantee that because the decision is ultimately up to you and to your organization. But you can spend a lot of money paying consultants to come in and do that. Now, I'm not saying that if your organization, depending on what level of influence you have within your organization or even your department, depending on funds you have, it can be helpful, quite frankly, to have an outside person come in and to facilitate the planning process. I would actually be called in quite frequently at State Farm when I was a leadership development consultant there, not because I was this genius when it came to strategic planning. I'd read up on it, I've read some systems, studied it a little bit, but really my value and my benefit by helping to these groups, to these teams, was I was an outside person who could facilitate the conversation, didn't really have a stake involved other than I wanted them to be successful. But by doing that, then I could keep them on task, keep them on focus, help facilitate the conversation. So there can be value there in having someone from the outside. But I just say that to say there's lots of different ways of approaching planning. I mentioned at the beginning of the last lecture that concept of periodization, and then I showed you through the planning components just different ways of approaching it, and that's a pretty general way of looking at it. But what I want to introduce you to in this lecture is this idea of scenario planning. And scenario planning is typically used for fairly long-term planning. Now, you could use it somewhat for short-term, but by short-term, I'm meaning 2 to 3 years, maybe, probably at the minimum. It's really designed for more long-term thinking, long-term planning aspects. And so if you look at the slide, not the one that says scenario planning, I'm going to use Shell Oil as an example, and you see 3 pictures there. And different organizations have used scenario planning over the years, but Shell Oil is probably the one most known for scenario planning. And they used it when they were back Royal Dutch Shell Oil Company. So they've been using scenario planning at least since the 70s, maybe even the 60s. So they've used it for a long time. To my knowledge, still are using it. And the guy who really was the head of scenario planning for Shell and kind of helped put it on the map, he actually wrote a book about it, Developing the Long View, I think is the name of the book. I've read the book. I still have it somewhere. It's in one of my boxes. But his name is Arie de Geus. Degues, I believe. And he is the one who really did a lot of work with scenario planning with the Shell Oil Company, and then he's gone on to consult with other companies on doing similar things. But the reason and so you may be wondering, well, if it's so long-term and, companies like Shell Oil, they're big, big companies, I would not propose to you that you use all of the aspects of scenario planning. It's probably not feasible for any of us unless you're in a leadership team of a multi-million-dollar company. And I don't think we have anyone like that in the program. To do the full-blown scenario planning is not feasible. But there are some components of it that I like, the long-term thinking, and especially tying back up to servant leadership, to talk about wisdom, reading what's going on, and then making informed decisions, as well as what we're going to be talking about in another lecture. I think it'll be the one after this, talking about scanning the environment and things like that. So it has connections there. So let me tell you a little bit about scenario planning. The way scenario planning works, and then I'll tell you an example that involves those other two pictures you see there. But the way scenario planning works is when it's time to do another round, and they're always in these cycles. So I put it this way, but let's say they're going to start a group. So they've always got groups running, because that way they're running concurrently. That way they're always looking to the future is the idea. But they're going to start a group. And who they gather into this group is a wide variety and diversity of thinkers. So they will have some of their own people from Shell Oil, from different departments. But then they also pull in political scientists. They pull in historians. They pull in, futurist is kind of a term for some thinkers. Entrepreneurs, humanitarians, environmental scientists. All kinds of different individuals will be pulled in to be part of this particular planning group. And they are now going to be together for a pretty substantial length of time, maybe a couple of 3 years. And so a lot of times what these individuals do is they put their other careers on hold, and Shell Oil will pay them for those years. That basically, like if you're a professor at a college, they would ask you to do this. You would take a leave of absence and go and do this. So all that to say, they pull in a wide variety of individuals. And you may be wondering, why do they pull in such a wide variety? Because they want to look at these issues, in the future, if you will, from every possible angle. That's what they're doing with scenario planning. And so these individuals do a ton of research, and they're given a particular challenge or a particular thing to look at. And basically the question is, should we plan for this event? Should we plan to move forward with this project? That's kind of what's leading them. So they're not just starting blank. Each group is given kind of a situation as far as a question, should we plan for this? Right? And so then they go to work on it. And what they write are, and the reason it's called scenario planning is, they write up a variety of scenarios that could happen based on the research and the information that they have. And I'm going to give you a tangible example here in a minute that'll probably help it make even more sense. But they write up these scenarios that are very plausible. Now, I should also say this. They pull in like movie screenwriters. That's another group I just thought of. They'll pull in like Hollywood script writers and creative writers because they want to write the scenarios in a compelling way. And I think that's cool. It's like, so it's not just a dry, boring bullet point list. Here's what might happen. They actually write these things as stories. So they script them out. And they will write out multiple scenarios. And then they kind of refine it down. And typically, they'll come up with about 3 scenarios that they then present to the executives and say, we think these are the 3 most plausible scenarios that could happen that you need to watch to help make a decision along the way about whatever this big decision is. And so there is a little bit of fiction in the scenarios from the standpoint of they're looking to the future. What could happen? But it's based on solid research, projecting things out in historical movements, because we've seen these things happen before. History repeats itself, right? So they're pulling in all of this, and they're looking at these things, and then they're writing up these compelling narratives, and then telling their executives, here are the things that you need to be thinking about. And what's built into each of these, they usually end up with 3. What's built into them is a little bit, I don't know if you ever read, I used to like these stories, but the choose your own adventure stories. I don't know if you remember those or not, but you would be reading along, and then you get to the end of the one chapter, and it was like, if you want to choose to do this, go to chapter 5. If you want to choose to do this, go to chapter 6. And so then, I want to go chapter 6. You do chapter 6, and then you can choose from there. And then it leads you along, and there's, a few different possible endings. And then it was great because you could always read those books like 3 times to get all the different endings. But it was choose your own adventure stories. In a little bit of a way, that's what these scenarios are. Not that they get to choose their own adventure, but it's almost, okay, as you're reading this scenario, here's what could be happening. Now, if this happens, if we see this monumental historical event that could happen, proceed with this scenario. Or if it doesn't happen, this one's done. Shut it down and move to one of the others because we cover that in one of those. So that's what I mean. It's kind of choose your own adventure. And then they see how they play out. So let me give you a tangible example that might help make a little more sense out of that. So in the 1970s, they were working on one of their scenarios. And the big question was, do they think they would ever get access to oil deposits that were under, and I can't remember which sea it was, that was at that time controlled by the Soviet Union? Would they ever, because at that point the Soviet Union did not allow anyone to come in and drill in their areas. Only their own people could. And so Shell Oil is looking, and they knew under this one particular sea in the territory held by Soviet Union, there was a very rich oil reserve. In order to get to that reserve, not only did they need permission, but they would have to build a new version of this platform that they didn't have. They didn't have one, so they were going to have to build a brand new one. They had the plans for it, and it was called like the Troll or something like that. And that's not necessarily a picture. That was just a picture I found of an oil platform. But this platform, to build it, would cost millions of dollars. So obviously the big question is, do we invest the millions of dollars to build this platform in the hope that someday the Soviet Union will loosen restrictions and open things up and allow us to drill on this rich deposit? The other part of that was this, because someone might say, well, just wait and see. And then if the Soviet Union loosens up and opens up, then you build your platform and then you go and drill. But the problem with that situation was it would take, and I don't remember how many, but several years to build this platform. They had the design for it, but to actually build it, it would actually take several years. And in the meantime, a competitor may have what they needed, and so they may be able to go in as soon as, if the Soviet Union decided to open things up. Here's Royal Dutch Shell Oil Company wanted to be able to, as soon as the Soviet Union said, we will allow drilling to be able to say, hey, we've got the equipment, we're ready to put it in like tomorrow, exaggerating a little bit, but we're ready to put it in tomorrow, here's our bid, here's what we can do. They wanted to be ready to do that. But again, do we invest the money in the hopes that this would happen? So that's kind of the scenario, the setup. And so the scenario folks went about writing up their different scenarios. And I put a picture there of Mikhail Gorbachev, because this was the 1970s, right? Now, Gorbachev became a household name when I was growing up in the 80s. I mean, I was born in the 70s, but, really became aware of world politics, things like that. We all knew who Gorbachev was. Ian Reagan had a lot of meetings, things like that. And if you know anything about Gorbachev, if you recall, he was definitely more of a soft liner than his preceding premiers over the Soviet Union. I mean, you think of Nikita Khrushchev, right? And Dropov. I mean, they were pretty hard liners. So in the 70s, Gorbachev is rising in the ranks of the Communist Party in Russia. And what the Shell Oil Company, their scenario planners, they're writing all these things out, but he was relatively unknown. But one scenario that they had said, keep an eye on this younger guy by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev. Because based on their research and knowing what they knew, they said, if he continues to rise in power, one, we know he's more of a soft line approach. He's more open to opening things up. And that tells us if he's continues to rise in the ranks, then that means there's a greater movement within the Communist Party to open things up. And they had different checks along the way. And so as they see Gorbachev start to rise, then they knew, okay, let's start moving forward. And they would have checks along the way. Is this still happening? Yep. Keep moving forward with that, with building the platform and investing the money. Long story short, and it was then even into the 80s, Gorbachev is a premier. The Soviet Union decides to open up drilling rights. Shell Oil is ready to go. They're like, hey, we're ready. We've got the platform. Again, little exaggeration. We can be there tomorrow. Here's our pitch, our bid. And they got it. So that's kind of a cool story, right? Because most of us didn't even know who Gorbachev was until he became the premier. These guys, before he became there, said, keep an eye on that guy. Because and that's the kind of thing that scenario planning does. It identifies these players because a lot of research, a lot of smart people go into it. And again, you may be looking at it going, well, that's great for Shell Oil and multi-billion dollar companies. I'm just running an academic program. Right, but this is where if we have the mindset of scenario planning, okay, we're not going to write up all these scenarios. You're not going to hire Steven Spielberg to write your script for you or anything like that, right? But what you can be doing is paying attention to what's going on around you. Maybe you're on a facilities team, and maybe, you're with your college or your organization, you're looking around and you're like, it'd be really nice if we could acquire some more property. Well, what if we start to see these things happening? It may mean that person who owns that property is getting ready to sell. And if they are, if they're in a mind to sell, maybe we should be planting seeds now and saving up money so that we can walk in as soon as they say they want to sell that property. We've got a down payment in hand or all of the cash we need, whatever it might be, right? We're planning for that. Or with academic programs, are we monitoring what's going on in the greater environment? We're going to talk about scanning here in a little bit. But are we monitoring those things so that we're ready to move forward with a new academic program or with changes to our program as we need to, rather than what happens so often is we wait for the changes to hit and then 2, 3, 4 years later, we're now ready to move forward, and by then our competitors have blown past us. So that's the idea of scenario planning and how I can see it applying to us. So hopefully that was helpful to you, and then we're going to move on in the next lecture and start talking about the strategic thinking competencies. We'll see you then.